Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. And thanks everybody for coming out and venturing in this cold weather today. Really appreciate it. We've got a great crowd here today. And our guest speaker today, Siri Terjesen, is from Florida, and she actually picked this state because she wanted to experience the cold weather. Yesterday, everyone was talking about how cold it is and complaining about it, and she was talking about how excited she is. And truly, she's the only person I know that's excited about the weather today. So kudos to Siri. I'm really excited that Siri's here today. She's a good personal friend. She's also a good friend of NDSU and of the Challey Institute. She said that when she sees people at airports or other places with NDSU gear on, she always approaches them and starts talking to them about NDSU. So thank you for that as well, Siri. Siri Terjesen is a very accomplished economist and entrepreneurship professor, and I'm going to quickly read her bio, and we have a really great topic today, understanding the difference between capitalism and cronyism. And I think a lot of people are confused about the two of them, and I think it's really important to understand why, what the difference is, and Siri's going to help us with that today. Dr. Siri A. Terjesen is Associate Dean of Research and External Relations, Founding Executive Director of the Madden Center for Value Creation, and Phil Smith Professor of Entrepreneurship at Florida Atlantic University, and Professor Point 2 at the Norwegian School of Economics in Bergen, Norway. Dr. Terjesen is an internationally recognized expert in business, higher education, and philanthropy, and is amongst the world's top 2% most cited scholars, with over 22,000 citations to her 3 books and 100 plus peer-reviewed articles. She has been PI or co-PI on $12 million in research grants and gifts over her career. Dr. Terjesen has published in leading journals such as the Academy of Management Review, Journal of Management, Business Ethics Quarterly, Journal of Business Ethics, Leadership Quarterly, and Strategic Management Journal. Her research is featured in media including Bloomberg, U.S. News and World Report, The Times, and CNBC. Dr. Terjesen is current editor of Small Business Economics, Industry and Innovation, and Beta, and an editorial review member of several top journals. Her op-eds have been published in The Hill, Newsweek, Washington Times, Daily Signal, City Journal, Epoch Times, and other outlets. And so let's all give a warm welcome to Dr. Siri Terjesen.
Thanks so much, John. Thank you so much, John. And is that audio okay for you guys? And congratulations on the many wins at the Challey Institute over the years. It's been amazing. This time, yesterday, you had Challey researchers on the radio. I see quite a few in the audience who are doing really important work. And really kudos to you. And thanks to everybody for coming out. As John said, I am thrilled to be here. I'm Norwegian American, and I haven't experienced this cold, I think, ever. But I also really, sorry. That's my phone. I'll turn that off. And I am just super excited to talk to you about capitalism versus cronyism and the importance of understanding the differences. I've written some academic papers that are here, but I think the most important thing is to talk to the public, and I really look forward to your comments and questions at the end. To me, this is really important because this is the latest Gallup poll released in September 2025. And what you can see here on the graph from 2010 to 2025 is that a growing number of Americans, and especially young people, are disillusioned by capitalism. Americans are more positive towards capitalism than socialism still, but the 54% viewing capitalism favorably is down from 60% in 2021 and near that level in most prior years. They also ask about big business, and Americans are overwhelmingly positive about small business, 95%, and free enterprise, 81%, which, by the way, you can now get a certificate in here in private enterprise at NDSU. But they're far more negative towards big business, with only 37% rating it favorably and 62% negatively. So these perceptions of big business have tumbled in recent years, including a 9-point decline this year on top of a 6-point drop in 2021. In 2019, a slim majority of 52% still had positive views of big business. The high point was 58% in 2012. So what's happening? These perceptions of capitalism and big business. My thesis is that Americans don't understand the difference between capitalism and cronyism, and we'll unpack some of those differences. Now, it's very understandable because we can take a look at pop culture. There's so much anti-capitalist rhetoric in the TV shows, the movies, the music lyrics, and the media, and they present a really distorted view of capitalism. And importantly, they're missing the real enemy, which is cronyism, and they don't include big government. So, any of you familiar with these shows? Yes. So, first one there is White Lotus, which has been a TV show that's been streaming on HBO, and it's about the clash between wealthy visitors at a luxury resort and the workers. The next one is Succession, also on HBO, about the owners of a global media and entertainment conglomerate. And then there's Glass Onion, which is one of my kids' favorites, and it's a Netflix movie about the co-founder of a technology company who's invited others to a murder mystery on his island. So they tell stories about life under capitalism. They challenge their viewers to ponder the contradictions and the destructiveness of this system. The content is generated to appeal to that growing share of young people and all Americans who are skeptical of capitalism, and also because the writers are facing this. Nearly all of the folks who write for this are members of the Writers Guild of America. And it's been documented that they're increasingly economically disadvantaged in a system where their wages have stayed relatively flat. And just as I generated with ChatGPT, that image on the front slide, we can now use ChatGPT and other large language models and AI to generate scripts for us. So those folks are pretty worried about it, and they feel that capitalism is against them. And in fact, the WGA has a recent set of demands to limit AI use in script writing. But of course, we've always seen this in music. Traditionally, started with just the punk rock bands like The Clash, Dead Kennedys, Pink Floyd, and Refused that were targeting corporate power, working social class struggles, and the machine. But it's gone to include a lot of genres, including ska, rap, and a couple of them, like 2025, we have this song, Capitalism Breeds Devastation by Jer, and there's also Cheap Perfume, which has a new tune that's called Probably It's Capitalism. But again, these are missing the story behind the story, which we're going to talk about. And unfortunately, we've also seen this anti-capitalism rhetoric in universities. Understandable in some areas of universities for years because of biases, but increasingly in business schools. So I go to the Academy of Management alongside many management faculty here in this room, and a few years ago, the title of the conference was Capitalism in Question. And there have been very popular books, I would call them airport books, Amazon bestsellers, that talk about the need to change capitalism. Even earlier this week at the World Economic Forum, Larry Fink was talking about a new type of capitalism that's needed, and he's the CEO of BlackRock. And then, of course, we also have anti-capitalist rhetoric in business school syllabi, including at Harvard Business School. Now, all of this is missing a theme that you'll hear about later this year in the Challey Institute workshops, which is that capitalism has actually lifted billions of people out of poverty. If we look at the World Bank data with $3 per day, which was just revised up this year, the share of the world's population living on that level has dramatically fallen over the years. And even if we look at other measures of poverty from $3 to $5 a day, $5 to $7 a day, $7 to $10 a day, $10 to $20 a day, the share of folks living under those poverty levels has also dropped. But it's easy to understand why young people have been taken in. So if you're a freshman here at NDSU, you were born in 2008 or 2009, during this recent recession. You've seen people lose jobs, homes, savings. You've heard stories about people facing massive student debt. But young people also favor universal health care, affordable housing, and debt relief, all possible under capitalism. But certainly, young people don't favor abolishing private property, especially not here in North Dakota. But missing, again, from the movies, the TV shows, the books, has been the real villain, the big government. It's a little bit too hard to tell that story. And that's also because many of the media that's been created lately is created because they know that people are looking at their phones and they're distracted. So they've been actually dumbing down the content of this and putting the plots in multiple times so that people can follow it. And it's too complicated to bring in the real enemy, which is big government. But first, let's talk about what's capitalism. So Karl Marx originally popularized the term as a pejorative, but its defenders have adopted the term. And in all classic treatments of capitalism, which you would be exposed to at NDSU, I've personally sat in on some of the great reading groups here, you would learn that capitalism has three components. The factors of production are mostly privately owned, the resources are mostly allocated through markets, and individuals and groups are mostly free to engage in economic activity without centralized control or interference from the state. So capitalism is pro-market, not necessarily pro-business, and certainly not pro-certain businesses, because the goal of capitalism and an outcome of it is free trade and free movement of capital. Those are the byproducts. By contrast, we have the system of cronyism. The first two tenets are the same. We still have factors of production that are mostly privately owned and resources that are mostly allocated through markets. But the big difference is that individuals and organizations aren't always fully free to trade. There is significant influence from the state. And the bigger the government gets, the bigger the interference. And again, that's just a much harder story to tell in these movies. How can you bring in the role of big government and that these folks got bigger and bloated and had these attitudes because of their piece from big government? So cronyism is a system in which firms receive advantages over rivals from their influence with government officials rather than a superior ability to create value for customers. So the rent seeking is not based on the quality, it's based on the use of political influence. And there are so many examples, and we'll talk about a lot of these in detail. Business licenses and permits, judicial and legal protections, financial benefits such as tax breaks, government grants, subsidies, and loans, and they're often secured by lobbying government officials, donating to political campaigns, or outright corruption, and a lot of nepotism. And I think you can probably imagine some of those. I didn't put in the slides, but when we look at an index of cronyism, it's often based on which countries have which types of certain industries that are most susceptible to cronyism, including oil and gas. But why does cronyism exist? Well, we have this system where the government officials control the economic resources, and they enact regulations and laws that have the potential to benefit some firms more than others. And there's a lot of managers who have incentives and sometimes fiduciary duties to the shareholders to cultivate the influence with government officials to improve their firm's access to resources and manipulate information to government officials or distort government policies in their firm's favor. So let's take a basic scenario. Could be any NDSU student, anyone living in Fargo or nearby, and a few things are true in both cases. So we've got an individual with a business idea. That individual forms a company and makes a product from that idea, and consumers give the company money for the product, and the company becomes successful. But eventually, there will be someone else who has a better idea and creates a better product. Under the system of capitalism, consumers are able to give their money to the company that has the better product, and the new company becomes more successful. We can think of so many examples of this, whether it's cell phones, computers, other consumer goods. But under cronyism, the difference here is that the company uses its wealth to manipulate the government into giving it more power through tax breaks and regulations. So even when someone else produces a better product, the consumers are forced to continue buying the old product. And the most corrupt and manipulative corporations make the most money. There are no new players. Unfortunately, cronyism really flourishes under corruption. And this is a little picture from Transparency International of how much corruption there is. Corruption is the abuse of public power. Examples are bribes and kickbacks and also nepotism. Here in the US, fortunately, we are not amongst the most corrupt countries. You can see those in the dark red. But there is still corruption, and we'll give some of those examples. The first type of corruption is bribes. So these are quid pro quo payments to government officials in exchange for government policies and decisions that benefit those that are paying the bribes. There have been so many cases, and I'm actually deliberately picking slightly older cases, but we can talk about modern ones in the Q&A. In 2020, Airbus agreed to a record $4 billion in fines for using a global network of agents to bribe officials for plane sales. And of course, probably some of that was due to the very oligopolistic nature of the plane industry, where there's really only a couple of big players, Boeing, Airbus, and Embraer. Siemens paid fines of $1.6 billion for systemic worldwide corruption to secure public infrastructure projects. And that fine was just a little bit over the $1.4 billion estimated that they paid in bribes to government officials around the world. That was one of the very first cases in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And Goldman Sachs agreed to pay $2.98 billion in fines for bribery related to a major scandal in Malaysia. Although the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act makes it a crime to bribe foreign officials, there was very little enforcement until about a decade ago. And some countries historically allowed their firms to treat bribes as a tax deduction for ordinary and necessary business expenses. Another type of cronyism, which is corruption, is kickbacks. And kickbacks are when a portion of revenues or profits are paid to government officials in exchange for government policies and decisions that help generate those revenues or profits. There are unfortunately, again, many examples, quite a lot from medical companies, including Olympus, that paid $646 million in fines to settle allegations of providing kickbacks to doctors in the form of cash, luxury travel, and grants in exchange for using their products. Novartis paid a $678 million fine to resolve claims that they disguised kickbacks as speaker fees for educational events that never took place. And probably the most famous congressperson charged was Congressman Cunningham in California, who received a prison sentence after taking $2.4 million in kickbacks, including a $140,000 boat in exchange for steering government contracts. The third form of corruption and cronyism is nepotism, which involves hiring family or friends or government officials to cultivate the support of officials when designing government policies. There are so many examples, but probably the most recent and best is the president of Zimbabwe since 2017, who's appointed his son as the deputy finance minister, his nephew as the deputy tourism minister. That's cronyism because you're prioritizing family ties over necessary skills and experience. There's certainly other examples. The DRC, the Congo, the president, whose first name is Felix, has appointed his son Felix to a leadership position within the state-owned mining company. Nepotism hollows out institutions, wastes resources, deters investors, and leads to absolutely entrenched poverty. A final type of cronyism, which we actually see a lot more of in the US, is corporate political activity. It's not corruption, it's just a type of cronyism. And it's the use of lobbying, campaign contributions, and similar influence tactics to secure resources and favorable policies from government officials. And this manifests through this idea of a revolving door, through which influential individuals move between business and politics. So there's a lot of former elected officials and bureaucrats who are often placed on corporate boards, or they operate lucrative consulting firms. Top political appointees are often drawn from the ranks of corporations in highly regulated industries. So 3 of the last 8 US Treasury secretaries were actually partners at Goldman Sachs. And although CPA and corruption seek to achieve similar aims, they differ in that most forms of CPA, again, they're legal, they're regulated, and they're subject to public disclosure requirements. Nonetheless, there's a lot of variation across countries in terms of regulations and disclosure requirements related to CPA and in the extent to which political systems are amenable to corporate influence. Relative to the US presidential system, many European parliamentary systems have more irregular election cycles. So for example, they can call an election anytime in the UK, and perhaps they will. There's shorter campaigns, and there's less fragmented power structures. In Europe, the heads of regulatory agencies are also less likely to be political appointees. So probably compared to the US, Europe has fewer opportunities and benefits less from CPA to target specific politicians. Also, in Europe, there's a lot more fragmentation in political parties, and they tend to increase politicians' dependence in the US on corporate donors, thereby increasing the possibility for cronyism. Although most would argue that corruption is a form of cronyism, under cronyism, the incentives for CPA are much stronger. And there have been recent meta-analyses that show that government policies are more likely to favor firms that engage in certain forms of CPA, like advocacy through trade unions, and that CPA can relate positively to future firm performance. I'll just point out that with this revolving door, it's equally Democrats and Republicans. It's a story on both sides of the aisle. But I want to turn to the consequences of cronyism, because it's absolutely devastating, especially in emerging and transitioning economies, but also in innovative and developed economies like ours. And basically, this big push industrial policy to foster industrialization ends up funneling financial resources to only select firms through tax policies. And there's government subsidies, and there's low or zero interest loans, and there's just all kinds of protectionist policies. The best examples here have been the Asian firms, the Japanese kairetsus, so I'm showing you a network of firms that you probably recognize, and also Korean chaebols. And what happened in both countries, and after World War II, the government selected strategically important industrial sectors that were believed to be critical for economic development. So electronics, communications, heavy manufacturing, infrastructure, and transportation. And they directed government resources and policies to facilitate that sector development. These governments funneled the financial resources to select firms, again, through those tax policies, the government subsidies, the loans, and they enacted protectionist policies such as import quotas and specific access to business licenses to protect the focal firms from foreign and domestic competition. The governments also frequently exercised governance and control over what could be those chosen firms and set the export targets. And they would make the firms diversify into certain sectors in exchange for government support. So that's why when you look at these Korean firms, they make quite a lot of different goods sometimes, same firm. The result was the development and growth of these large business groups that addressed the problems of the underdeveloped factor markets and the weak institutions, really pulled them out of World War II. And those firms were able to compete very successfully on a global level. This was also tried in Argentina, Israel, Russia, and several other East Asian countries. But long-term, these policies generated harm. So when you've got politically favored firms that can thrive and grow, the other firms are likely to stagnate and fail. Similarly, those large and politically connected firms would oppose the emergence of innovative startups that represent new sources of competition. As a result, the big push policies ultimately hinder the long-term development of innovative startups in Japan and Korea. Moreover, the close ties between business and government likely contributed to the Asian financial crisis because they were stifling or delaying the needed regulatory reforms. enabling poor corporate governance and allocating capital extremely inefficiently. In both Japan and South Korea, there were major bribery scandals, criminal indictments of executives and government officials, and failure of firms that were supported by the government, like Daewoo, and setbacks in terms of entire industries. In turn, big push policies created short-term benefits and economic development, but basically fostered long-run slowdowns in those countries. And similar slowdowns have been observed in other countries. I just want to show you briefly what that looked like during the Asian financial crisis. So this was a little bit before our NDSU freshmen were born, but it was absolutely a direct result of this and really problematic. But cronyism also reduces social welfare, and there's examples all over the world. The biggest example is how much resources are diverted away from good causes to government causes. So in 2020, which is so far the worst, candidates spent 10.9 million, and this is up significantly since 2010. Below, I show you the stats for 2024. The good news is that there was less spending, at least for the presidential race. That's significantly down, but the congressional races were basically on par with the midterms in 2022 and a little bit less than 2020. Why is this problematic? The costs for campaigns are from individuals and organizations, but especially from private businesses and unions. Private interests spend $3.5 billion to lobby federal officials. There's also spending at state and local levels. And some of this also includes bribes. This is not mentioned, but the World Bank estimates that bribes on elections are about $1 trillion annually, which is 2% of global GDP. And this spending transfers wealth from owners, investors, and other stakeholders to government officials and diverts resources away from the really important projects, like more R&D in the companies, employee training. And cronyism also undermines the impartiality of economic and legal institutions. Politically connected firms can enjoy judicial and regulatory exemptions and treatment, as well as superior access to government contracts, grants, loans, and other financial resources. Likewise, capital controls restrict certain firms' access to private sector financing, thereby freeing up capital for firms with more political influence. Indeed, political influence lowers firms' capital cost, especially during periods of economic growth and stability. Relative to small firms, cronyism can be less costly and more effective for larger firms because they just have greater stocks of financial resources, employees, and influence. These firms often use their political connections to lobby for certain laws and enforcement procedures that, again, discourage entry and competition from other firms. In this way, cronyism favors the large firms, which can then increase the exit rates of small firms and distort investments and competition overall. So you'd see lower rates of investment in startups, less people willing to take a chance on startups. So cronyism penalizes those firms that are more capable, innovative, and efficient, yet lack their competitors' political influence. And consistent with this view, firm share prices increase when their investors or former directors enter politics, presumably because these individuals can direct resources or favor the focal firms. Conversely, a country's regime change is more likely to hurt firms that had political ties to the old regime. I'm not citing the academic research behind this, but there's been quite a lot. And just to conclude, I want to talk about the reductions to social welfare, because I think this is where we see it every single day. Cronyism incentivizes government officials to enact more regulations, which increases their opportunity to solicit financial contributions, legal or otherwise, in exchange for regulatory favors. Cronyism also reduces regulatory transparency because the government officials and firms have now incentives to hide the effects of political influence. And along these lines, politically connected firms often have an interest in weaker property rights, which can allow them to exploit other firms, expropriate intellectual property, and also use their political influence to protect their own property rights. There was a study of more than 41 countries that supported those arguments. And the potential for cronyism was associated with more expansive government bureaucracies and regulations, more difficulties, and longer delays in obtaining business licenses and weak accounting laws. At the same time, cronyism strengthens the informal economy, both by weakening the regulatory environment and by incentivizing firms to operate informally in the hopes of reducing their visibility and susceptibility of bribery attempts. The strength of the informal economy, in turn, then deprives the government of tax revenue and allows firms to skirt government regulations, further reducing the strength and effectiveness of institutions. Fifth, and perhaps as a result of these problems, cronyism diminishes several macroeconomic outcomes and can create vicious cycles that stunt economic development. The unpredictability, the favoritism, the poor property rights, the lack of transparency, they all hinder entrepreneurship, access to external capital, domestic startup activity, and foreign firm entry. Cronyism also hinders domestic firms' internationalization efforts because political ties transfer imperfectly or not at all into foreign markets. In these ways, cronyism obstructs the very critical sources of new ideas, innovations, products, services, and processes. It also creates perceptions of injustice, lowers incentives, and reduces inefficiency. And that's, I think, what we see, again, in those movies and TV shows and lyrics, that workers come to believe that luck, birth, connections, and/or corruption deter actual wealth, which discourages effort, reduces confidence in the private sector, and stunts economic growth. And it's just a destructive form of reciprocity that disadvantages entities that lack the proper political connections. When governments provide financing and other incentives to politically connected firms, those firms and their owners can grow especially powerful and wealthy, and they keep contributing to politicians and strengthening the cycle. So crony capitalism is more like when there are fewer individuals who control more of a country's firms and banks, because these individuals have far more political power. Others have really expanded on this argument. For example, in the UK, the greater dispersion of power and wealth led to more dispersion of political power, and an earlier and more successful emergence of capitalism there than in France, which had more concentration of wealth and political power and allowed for more extractive institutions. Research suggests that cronyism is responsible for greater instability and for lower economic development, innovation, internationalization, foreign investment, and economic growth. There have been studies over many years and over dozens of countries. And lastly, reflecting these economic problems, cronyism is associated with a variety of social problems. Ineffective governments caused by cronyism have reduced health care for children, including inadequate access to safe water, malnutrition, and poor medical health care. It's also been linked to weaker and more poorly enforced protections for the natural environment. And there's been a multi-country study that found that the potential for cronyism was associated with higher income inequality and lower quality infrastructures. So those are the real stories that can't be told to distinguish capitalism from cronyism. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Yes.
Two questions. One, what would you say are some of the most important reforms that can be made specifically in the U.S.? And two, what would you say are some of the most overlooked examples of cronyism?
Okay, thank you. I'll repeat those. The first question is, what are the most important reforms that we could do here in the United States? And the second question is, what are some of the most overlooked examples? So let me take the first. As a business school professor and also associate dean, I think it's important that we talk about cronyism in our classrooms and help folks distinguish the difference. And I think that this goes hand in hand with just basic financial literacy training, that people understand the difference. Now that's just at a classroom level. I think we can also expose the levels of cronyism. Unfortunately, there really aren't great measures of this. I've heard people promise it, but as I mentioned earlier, there's like an index of cronyism around the world, but all it is an index of certain industries that tend to have a lot of cronyism and which countries have the highest concentration of those industries. So you get Singapore showing up as the most cronyistic country in the world, but that's just because they have a greater presence of those. We need to share the stories and I think name and shame people for cronyism. I've deliberately picked examples that are not in 2025 or even 2024, or even some that have come out in 2026 and not here, but where there are examples, we need to call people out and expose them. And I think teach the ethics of this. When I first started teaching the FCPA, I'm old enough that it really wasn't enforced. So we would talk about it, and I never really said to my students it wasn't enforced, but of course it is enforced. And it's important to follow up on those cases. So depending on the types of cronyism, there were over 60,000 cases reported in the US alone, so it's important to follow up on those. So that's to your first question. For the second one, what are the most overlooked examples? So I chose some of the biggest dollar ones. You know, when you're talking about billions of dollars, that's even more money than in some university systems per year. But certainly there are overlooked examples because people don't want that corruption to be exposed. I think a lot of information is still coming out in Minnesota, but from what I have read, Nick Shirley did a really good job publicizing that and had a really good YouTube presence. But there were others who had been saying, hey, I'm not really sure that there's so many of these businesses that are actually really operating. But they were unsuccessful because the very people who were letting this fraud happen were also potentially getting the CPA, the donations from those same individuals. So I think, and of course, it can be very, very, very difficult and personally challenging on lots of levels to call this out and then continue to live in those communities. Thank you. Yes? Thank you. Yeah. So the question is, how do you get folks to distinguish cronyism from the definition that most people see, which is about hiring your friends or your relatives? And I tried carefully in this presentation to present capitalism versus cronyism, but we can also call it crony capitalism. But unfortunately, crony capitalism makes it seem like it's still capitalism, when in fact it's not capitalism because it favors some individuals over others and is due to the growth of big business. I think for a lot of people, they may see cronyism more personally. And for example, I was asking on my wonderful drive here, my Radisson driver from the airport, and I asked her what she thought of some political things, and she said, well, you know, to be honest, I just don't follow politics at all. Okay, that's fine, and a lot of people don't, and thank goodness, because it can be a rabbit hole, but you can see cronyism in your personal life, right? You can see cronyism in certain people being hired or promoted in an organization or get favors, and you can certainly call that out, and I think it's important. And unfortunately, I think these are psychological tendencies by certain people, such that you might see that also amongst politicians, and the stakes are much higher. And of course, many of them get approached all the time, but it's absolutely understandable that people normally wouldn't see the role of cronyism in terms of government. Thank you. Yes?
Can corruption ever be efficiency enhancing in environments with extraordinarily weak public institutions?
Oh, good question. So the question is, can corruption ever be efficiency enhancing in environments with just terrible institutions, right? I'm going to argue that it can't be, because corruption begets corruption. And as soon as you go down that road, there's the potential for more corruption, right? There's a little thing, and then there's a little thing. And I think we see this everywhere. I remember my friend telling me her husband worked at Oracle, and he was saying that in his experience, people fudged a little bit of this, like on their receipts, and then they fudged a lot of it. And getting away with things, or seeing that other people are corrupt, and you think, well, that's the only way forward. I'm curious, do you ever find examples where corruption could be efficiency enhancing?
I looked at that many years ago in grad school and wasn't able to get a clear answer. But if the public institution is so dysfunctional, so weak, maybe the only way to get an import off the boat is with a bribe. That would be. So I don't know the answer.
Yeah, and so the gentleman responded that he'd looked at this in grad school and hadn't found any evidence. And I think it's pretty hard to find evidence unless you're close. I think there are a lot of examples, including modern day. There were allegations, mostly only published in Danish, which I can read, and Greenlandic, which I can't read, where there were allegations that some of the 31 elected parliament members from Greenland had used their political connections to allow certain investors, especially from China, to potentially have access to the mineral rights in Greenland over an open market. And that this is one of the reasons why the US wanted to get more closely involved. And certainly, perhaps the politicians were well-meaning because they wanted Greenland to be able to extract the minerals from the earth, which they have not been able to do very successfully considering how many there are, but the costs are like 3 times at least, maybe 10, 30, or 300 times what it costs to extract the same minerals if they're present in the US or in Canada or elsewhere. But corruption wasn't the answer for getting those government contracts, because they do require someone who lives in Greenland to be part of them. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes? Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. This is a great question. I'm so glad that we have folks who are majoring in all kinds of different majors. So this young lady is training to be a registered dietitian, and she's interested in the food market and the subsidies for crops that might affect that. Now, if subsidies are only provided to certain companies and not all companies universally, then we have cases of cronyism. But certainly there are cases where there are subsidies in order to produce more. Now we can look at the CPA, the corporate political activity side of this, and we can, for example, look at last week when Robert Kennedy Jr. and his deputy HHS Secretary Jim O'Neill announced the new food pyramid and also school lunches. And so some foods, I think, right, milk is in, and I think there's less bread, right? So, you know, what is the potential for lobbying behind this? We don't know. What was the potential for lobbying behind all the other school lunch decisions over the last 50 plus years that those programs have existed? I don't know, but it can certainly be looked into. An interesting case that's happening in Scandinavia, because I feel like I'm in little Scandinavia here, is the case of Bovaer. Are you familiar with this? It's something that cows can eat to be less flatulent, because that's the cause of emissions around the world. But unfortunately, it can also trigger disease and death in cows. And that ingredient is produced by DSM and some other companies, and then it's sold to farmers and or automatically put in their feed, and then they have to feed it. They've been fighting this in Scandinavia. We have Bovaer in our milk here in America, but they've been fighting it in Scandinavia, especially the last 2 or 3 months, videoing the cows that are dying. And just last week, Tina, which is basically the only milk company in Norway, but they buy milk from all the farmers across Norway, but they said that they would not be buying any milk with Bovaer. So that was a good example. But we can imagine that the firms like DSM that produce these chemicals would be lobbying so that there would be no regulation. So I think that there's lots of examples in the market. And certainly for dietitians, it would be the same as other medical providers, that there would be the potential for bribery or kickback. So bribery to buy the medical equipment or prescribe the drug, and then also kickbacks once you did that. So that's certainly an area of influence. Thank you. Yes?
You mentioned the word ethics at one point. So how does that relate to cronyism? Does it redefine ethics, or does it toss it into the ditch?
Thank you. So thank you. This gentleman's asked, you mentioned the word ethics. Does that relate to cronyism? And I didn't have a chance to get into all the ethical philosophies and perspectives on this, but I think at the end of the day, we could argue that individuals who engage in cronyism don't have a sense of ethics, that there should be fair play for everyone. Instead, they're willing to privilege some organizations and some individuals above others, and there's a need to return to ethics. And business ethics is either a required course or it's required to be integrated into lots of courses, including taught by our business law faculty here in the audience. But we need to have real cases, and we need to mention these big government examples. Thank you. Yes.
Big government examples. Well, we can begin with Citizens United. That's one of the laws that doesn't exactly foster involvement of the individual, but more towards the corporation having influence. That's one area. And there, I wrote down a whole bunch of stuff because I'm actually one of those who lived and worked in most of those corrupt countries that we talk about for almost 20 years. And sometimes you have to do something for that country that smells like corruption in order for the masses to actually benefit. I worked in the power industry, and you want people to have access to electricity, and you can't get above or beyond a certain step unless some wheels are lubricated. I'm not advocating for corruption because that's not what I mean. If something has to happen for the vast majority of those people, well then you have to make sure that it happens. And hence the reason why some Scandinavian countries, and by the way, some Scandinavian countries, they allow you to write off some of this kind of money in their tax returns every year. It sounds unreasonable here. It isn't actually always like that. But then we can also bring up other samples. Those are the kind of things that really must be in place in the country before you start giving foreign aid to them. And I think that's all I want to say to us now, but thank you for coming and talking about it because it's really important. All right?
Tusen takk. Vi skal tale langs. Thank you so much. So I guess many of you heard this gentleman's Danish and has worked in many emerging economies around the world and relayed that that there is quite a lot of this, and he's seen it over time. I couldn't agree more. And that there's an importance of audits and more reforms. And I guess since you're Danish, and since Greenland is in the news, I'll pick up on this. One example has been, there's a study about 3 or 4 months ago published by some researchers at Copenhagen Business School showing that the most influential and connected people, remember Greenland is a country of, depending on how you count and who's actually there, 30,000 to 60,000 people are registered in Greenland. Whether or not they're there all the time, they're like Floridians, because they don't, in Greenland you don't pay taxes if you live there 6 months or more of the year. So you have a lot of Danes moving there and back and forth. But what was going on there that's of interest is that in this study there's only like 125 people who controlled all of the business in Greenland. So this is a country that's the same size as our Louisiana Purchase, so absolutely ginormous, and just 125 people. So, it was okay. Now, this is being exposed, and it doesn't take place anymore, but in order, you probably remember those days, in order to encourage Danes to move to Greenland to take jobs there, they paid them 50% to double more than what the Greenlanders made for the same work, whether it was accounting, plumbing, stonemasonry, and you can also see that in the tax returns. But that's no longer the case. But certainly when we look at the businesses that are large in Greenland, and it'll be fascinating to follow this into the future, they were pretty much majority Danish owned, even if they were under a Greenlandic umbrella. And there are some that would argue that although there was a huge block grant into Greenland to support the welfare of the people, if you look at the tax receipts and what was going out, there was a lot more taken out. So I think it's a fascinating area, and it only takes careful study. I think in the US, we've been able to expose some of this through Doge efforts, but it's in my view, it's been really just the clickbait and the tweets and a few graphs, but nobody's systematically written deep academic studies so far of what has been uncovered, especially under the last 12 months, and certainly people haven't done that in other areas. Thank you. Yes.
Between the bribes and the kickbacks and the CPA, there seems to be an affection of our legislative branch as well as the executive. What are your thoughts about the judicial, the balance, the counterbalance between those?
Great question. So the bribes, the kickbacks, and the CPA in the legislative branch, what could be done in the judicial branch? Probably, the best case on that was Congressman Cunningham, when they did actually charge him, sent him to jail for earlier, but we could certainly do a lot more of that. And I hope we never get into a position where the judges who are appointed, you can look back and you can see a lot of CPA in that regard too. And of course also taking out some judges and replacing them with others has certainly been an area we could question in the future. Thank you. John.
So would you agree that an implication of this is when you talk about what we can do about it is like sharing stories and changing people, but would you agree that an implication is maybe advocating for smaller government programs because you have less opportunity to lobby for favors if there's less power of government in the first place?
Thank you, John. Great question and statement. We've talked about these other implications, but isn't one to advocate for small government? And that's so important for me that I guess I assumed it was in there, but indeed, we need to advocate for smaller government. There's a wonderful network of organizations across the US and also across the world advocating for smaller government and communicating those wins. And I think there are now good stories. In my lifetime, up until Javier Milei was elected, Argentina was a pretty sad story of excess government, fraud, et cetera. And he's really turned that around, and he was an economics professor and understood that well. But I think we need to work on that every single day. Yesterday, I had the fortunate chance to talk with Betty Grand, who'd been a legislator here in North Dakota for a long time, and she worked for Rough Rider policy and now for pro-family. And she said, you know, I think we got into this problem lately here and also in Minnesota because the role of the church and families subsided. So instead of taking care of our loved ones and extended families, we depended more and more on the government to do that, and we allowed the largesse to grow. And when you have cases like in Minnesota, potentially $9 billion in fraud, that's a pretty big number. And when government gets so big, you can't detect that. I love to do genealogy, and I have a lot of relatives who lived in Minnesota in the Iron Range, especially over the years, barely eking out a living 100 years ago here. And you can't imagine that any of that fraud could have taken place back then, because the government was really small and people were going to take care of their own, or there were associations like the Sons of Norway that were communal and not government. And I think we need to advocate and go back to those. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, we'll take you and then you.
Just was wrong. Scandinavia. And North Dakota is Scandinavian as well as Germans from Russia predominantly. And we are very, very large. We're the largest government per capita basis in the country. Lots of protectionism that exists here. Is there possibly a link, like a cultural heritage that brought that? I mean, there are lots of other factors. There's extraction, oil extraction revenues that just, we have the money, so we spend it. But I wonder if, because collectivism in Scandinavia is, the history of it and its persistence is kind of misunderstood by Americans. And is it that collectivism, is that in our DNA?
That's a great question. I would really love to look into that. The question is about whether there's something in the Scandinavian, German, Russian DNA of folks here in North Dakota with the 5th largest government that led to that. And you also mentioned the misperceptions of Scandinavian capitalism. We didn't get into the different varieties of capitalism, but there are different varieties. But as you point out, there is a lack of understanding of the importance of capitalism in Scandinavia. Bjorn Lomborg has written about that in Sweden. Stefan Slok-Madsen has written about it in Denmark. But actually, well, for Norway, it's a big story of the oil wealth for sure in the North Sea. But for the others, especially it has been capitalism, and people don't always realize that. And then, of course, and I'm always so thrilled, and I encourage you to have lunch there at the Sons of Norway later today, but I'm so thrilled to see a thriving Sons of Norway Lodge here, and that there are still institutions like that. There aren't always. This is one of the best in the country. But as those dissipate, then people may have a tendency to turn to the government. But it'd be interesting to unpack that and look at the differences. Thank you. And I guess last question?
So, kind of what I take away is that you give $50 to a cop, that's a bribe, that's a crime. You give $10 million to a political campaign or a building project that is soliciting for money, and that's a donation, and that's protected under Citizens United. And I see that as just a more consolidation to the rich and powerful having more power than the people. And eventually that just turns into revolution. It's the only way to do it.
Yeah, thank you. So this gentleman has also brought up Citizens United, also from our Danish friend. And the statement was about you can give $50 to a cop, that's a bribe, but you can give $10 million in a political campaign, and that's a donation. And I think it's a very valid question. I'm sure many of you get approached for political donations. I do, quite often, especially now that we have an election for mayor even. And we have to figure out a stand on that. My stand is that I don't make any political donations, because as soon as you go down that hole, you go really down that hole. And if you say yes to someone, you'll have to say, you may feel like you need to say yes to a lot of people. Should there be limits? Most certainly. Can we flag these? Certainly. And again, this is on both sides of the aisle. If we, for example, look, and again, this is the difference between the US and in Europe. So in Europe, the Danish ambassadors have all come up through the government system. In the US, the ambassadors to the most prestigious countries have come up as, and are donors nearly always. And then the less desirable countries that have less safe environments, it'd be harder to place your families, and those are career Department of State employees. So I think we can expose that. And we can flag the importance of people who have made it through their own intellect and resources, rather than the connections, and whether those are family connections or political donations. Thank you.
So we're out of time, but thanks. Let's give one more round of applause to Siri for a great presentation.
Thank you.